Tom, the other day I was standing in the grocery aisle waiting to check out. I noticed there were some rain clouds outside. And, I thought about doing that thing where I'm like, looks like it's going to rain outside. But I stopped myself because it doesn't feel like weather can be even just like that small talk topic anymore.
Shell, if you can't talk about the weather in line at the grocery store, we got some problems going on.
I love the weather. I talk about the weather all the time. Yeah. Thinking back, there was always that whole rule, right? Thanksgiving table. There's two things you don't talk about. You don't talk about politics. You don't talk about religion. But now it almost feels like there's a third subject that's been added in, which is weather, because rightfully so, people's minds go to climate change.
Yeah. And if you're people like us who work at Climate Central, in climate science, and about communications, well, at the table, everyone knows if you bring up the weather, you're probably going to hear some sort of lecture from climate people Tom and Shell. And
Yeah,
who wants
and
that?
sure, we're not here to lecture, but we're here to help make the connection. And that's what I kind of want to do today. So, welcome to Curiously Climate. It is a podcast from us here at Climate Central for people like you who are the climate curious. I'm Shel Winkley.
And I'm Tom DiLiberto. And in this episode, we have someone who can actually help us drill down in how best we can communicate climate change to people all over the place. We're happy and super happy to have Laura Thomas Walters, an environmental social scientist with a focus on behavior change, who, get this, Shell, co-author of the guide, How to Speak with Your Family and Friends About Environmental Issues, which seems awesome.
So I'm an environmental social scientist. So like I think a lot of conservation people, I got into this because I love animals. I love all the cool big animals like rhinos and tigers and elephants and octopuses. And yeah, they're all great. They're all cool. They're all cuddly. Though obviously you shouldn't go trying to cuddle rhinos and tigers, sadly. But as I started studying this in university, I very quickly realized that most of the environmental issues aren't really about animals at all. They're all about people. Unfortunately, almost every problem that's facing like the environment, that's facing different species, that's facing us, is under human behavior. So I sort of pivoted and started to look into, well, how do we change human behavior? Luckily for me, that's an incredibly interesting area. And actually probably more interesting than just going and looking at wild animals is. And I've done a bit of that, and they mostly just like poo and sleep. And that does get a little bit old after a while. Whereas humans are a lot more intricate. So studying our behavior is still very interesting, even if it's depressing at times when you're like, why? Why won't you just change?
Well, we are an animal, so it's just a most confounding animal that can possibly be. But one of those things related to behavior change, as it relates to climate change. I'm curious your thoughts about what the biggest misconception people have about talking about climate change with friends and family.
So the biggest thing I think is there's this real sense of like climate dissonance where we all sort of assume that other people don't care as much as we do, so we don't want to talk about it. And there's been like loads of psychological studies on this where, they've like asked people, how much do you support climate policies? How much do you think your friends and family support climate policies? And everyone underestimates how much other people care. And that's really sad. And it's also a really big hindrance to talking about it, because you don't want to be the awkward one at the dinner party. You don't want to be the one bringing up the depressing topic if you think no one else is going to care about it. And I really do sort of blame politicians and the media as a whole for this. Like, they sort of try to paint climate as a dirty word, that you don't bring up in polite conversation. And even I felt the same as well, felt the same way. I started doing a postdoc, so like a big research project that was specifically about how do we get people who are currently vegetarians, vegans, etc., to talk to their friends and family about eating a more plant-based diet, because that's one of the biggest things you can do for the environment. And I've actually been vegan for 18 years, but I also like never talked about it because I don't want to be that stereotype of the preachy vegan. And I'd always be afraid to bring it up in case like people thought I was judging them or it got offended or something. So I would very rarely talk about it myself until I started this research project. And I was like, I've really got to put my money where my mouth is. If I'm telling people that they need to talk about this, like I ought to do as well. So I screwed up my coverage and I started talking about climate and environmental issues to like just all sorts of random people. I spoke about it to the beautician who's doing my eyelashes. I spoke about it to my hairdresser. I spoke about it to the bus driver, to the Sainsbury's supermarket delivery man. And even knowing the size, even knowing that like we underestimate how much other people get, I was still surprised again by like I had no pushback. Just everyone would agree with me. We might have like different opinions about what the solutions should be, but everyone I spoke to was completely on board with, yeah, climate change is an issue and it is messing things up. Like everybody. The beautician that I went to, and she had an assistant there who was quite upset because her background, I think she came from Bangladesh, and she's like about how her family have experienced the impacts of like climate change firsthand. The delivery driver was saying like how he's noticed how the like weather patterns have been changing and he knows it's down to climate change, but he doesn't know what to do about it. Like I said, I was, even knowing the science, I was still surprised and, very pleasantly surprised.
So that's interesting. I work in climate like every single day. I come to work and I work on communicating climate change. But when people ask me what I do, I never not shy away from it. But some people I can instantly know, like, yeah, I can say like, hey, I work for this organization. We're working on climate change. And with some people, I'm like, oh, I'm in this organization and we do weather and data and science. And it takes me maybe like 15 seconds to get to the words climate change. Do you have any understanding of like what that initial read that when you're meeting somebody or you're talking to somebody, like, what is it that goes through our mind when you're trying to make that quick decision of like, is this somebody that can talk about this in a friendly way, or is this someone that I'm gonna have to like maybe coax it into the conversation more?
I don't know, but that'd be a really interesting research project. So then you'd be like, that is such a good question. And I mean, it is really important to understand your audience. Like, I don't know what is going on, like, subconsciously about how we are reading people that way, but knowing the values of your audience, knowing how you should approach the topic is super important. And it's why, like, normal people are good messengers, because we personally know the people we're talking to, so we can tailor arguments to them. So like when it comes to meat consumption, for instance, talking to my mum, I know that, pulling on her heartstrings is the way to go. And I'm like, do you not care about the way that your nieces and like great nieces, the world they're going to grow up into? Like, if you don't stop eating meat, what it's going to do to them. Whereas other people, other family members, I know that won't work on, but talking about the health benefits, is much more likely to get them on board. And it sounds like you're doing is maybe not fully consciously, but you're doing a similar thing of like, this is a person who's going to get the climate argument straight away. This is a person I need to ease in by approaching it from like a weather perspective.
Yeah. Well, if you ever want to dive into my head, I warn you, it's scary. Or like, more than welcome in. Okay, so in that same idea, I do a lot of my work on social media. Like most people, I spend a lot of my time on social media, for better or for worse. And it seems like a lot of times in some groups, data and facts are what you need for them to be like, yes, like that's the tweet, that's the post. But then also like a lot of times, like it doesn't matter the data that you put in there. It doesn't matter what background you give or how many sources you cite. Like it's just never going to work on social media. Like, why is it that sometimes data and facts don't resonate, even though that is the thing that says, yes, this is real. This is how climate change is working?
Because humans aren't logical, rational animals. We are story animals. We respond to stories that take us on an emotional journey. And, we're the best will in the world, even the prettiest graph, it doesn't take us on that emotional story. I think data works better on people who are already predisposed to agree with the argument, unfortunately. And again, there's been lots of studies around this where you present data supporting or supporting an argument to people who do or don't believe in that argument. And sometimes the more data you give them, if they don't already agree, the less they continue to agree. There's like a backfire effect where they just dismiss you even more as being biased and, hope to get them blah, 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 which is frustrating, but something we need to be aware of. So sometimes we need those stories to hook people, to get them online before we can start to present like the facts and figures and really drill down into the science of it.
In my time talking about climate change, the most impactful times was around, we have a flower called the bluebonnet down here in Texas. That is our state flower. And one year they came up in February and everyone was really excited and like taking their Instagram pictures. But then, earlier spring came, sign of climate change, but then spring still being spring, we had this big cold front come through and there was a killing freeze and all the bluebonnets went away. Everyone was like, what happened to the bluebonnets? And so, yeah, that's one of those moments where I can say, like, you love this thing, you value this thing. Not to say that every year this is going to happen to that thing, but this is one of the impacts that we know that climate change has on what essentially is a weed, but, that we'd love to take pictures of and put our kids into. So that's really interesting.
Sometimes I feel the hardest part, like I can talk about climate and climate change for years, but the hardest part's always kind of how to get into it with people. Like, how do you get into it with, like, your hairdresser, your bus driver? Like, what is the thing that gets me into that conversation? And sometimes I feel awkward bringing something like that up. I feel almost like the SNL sketch, the Debbie Downer, where I'm just kind of like bringing everything down. And I was wondering, tips. I think that was really good one, like relating it to like doing a better understanding of what makes this person tick and what things they care about, and whether you care about something similar and using that as kind of like this gateway into this broader conversation. But in your experience, like, have there been some really useful ways of like starting that conversation with folks?
So I'm lucky in that I'm British. So basically any conversation with a stranger will start by talking about the weather. It's like a cultural rule. So that's a really easy way. Whatever the weather is doing, and it's always doing something weird. And then when you always go, climate change, eh? And there's your intro. But I've also tried, and this might not be something that appeals to a lot of people, but I've tried wearing badges relating to like environmental issues, or Extinction Rebellion is a big climate activism, environmental activism group in the UK, and I've like worn like a badge like that. And people often then ask me about like, what does that symbol mean? And I just explain it's by an environmental group, and I care about this because blah blah blah. And that's also a good sort of icebreaker. It also sort of like lets people approach you to talk about it rather than you feeling like you're shoehorning it in.
Yeah. So do you think that works backwards too? Like anytime I go to a conference, I wear warming stripes, and I think a lot of meteorologists know what warming stripes are.
Mm.
But could it work backwards where it's like when you're walking down the street and you see someone with a survey in your hand, and they're going to ask if you have a couple minutes to like fill out a survey, and then they duck away, or like, so, at a mall kiosk, like, does it work backwards too if you maybe have that sort of descriptor on you?
It very well could do. That's why I think the Extinction Rebellion one is quite good, because it's like a little hourglass type symbol, and not a lot of people recognize it. So people will often ask what it is, not knowing what it is, and then it gives me the opportunity to talk about it, rather than like a big badge that says, ask me why I'm vegan, or whatever,
That mysterious nature just kind of draws people
Yeah.
in.
People may disagree with this, but I'm of the opinion that it's not worth my time to try and argue someone who's so fervently down that conspiracy black hole, in a don't feed the trolls type approach. Some people have more time and energy and will like try to decondition them, and like, I think more power to you. For me personally, I want to reach the fence sitters, the people in the middle. They're the ones where I want to put my effort, where I think I've got a better chance of like getting them on board. And they are, there's a lot of them as well. So if some people recognize any of the climate symbols I'm wearing and think, oh, she's brainwashed climate scientists and don't want to talk to me, that's okay.
When you think about like, okay, so think back to all the times you talked about climate change. Like, have you ever had a time where you like walk away from a conversation and you're like, that was not good? Like, I did not handle that well.
Oh, I mean, all the time. when you're
Yeah.
doing public. And usually I could tell, like, oh, this is going to be a difficult conversation because you can almost see the smoke coming out of people's ears when they find out that you're talking about climate and climate change. And you're like, oh boy, this person's coming in hot. And I was like, oh, it's climate change related. And they still don't get the joke. And often what I,
To be fair, it took me a second to get that joke. I needed you.
and then they get angrier because they don't get it. And it's just a whole big thing. Uh, what I've tried to do in the beginning, that was always the hardest part. Like, I didn't know how to react. And most people don't know how to react if someone comes at them incredibly, like, fervently against what they're about to say. It's like not a normal thing that happens to people in a given day. And what I realized helped me was that I changed the frame about what I was trying to do from I'm going to explain the impacts of climate and all this stuff. And I changed the frame to something much simpler. I just want this person to leave this conversation thinking I'm another human being. Or I try to find one thing we have in common. And as the temperature ratchets up, I can always kind of pivot to something else. But did that work every single time? No. But what it ended up doing is making me feel better after that sort of conversation, where I didn't let it ruin the other conversations I was going to have just because this one conversation did not go in a great direction.
Yeah. I think when I talk anywhere, like after this podcast, I'll do the same thing. But I always think about the things that I should have said or could have said, or like it would have been better. Right. So, Laura, I think the question maybe is then, how do you take those stumbles and become a better communicator going forward for the next time through?
I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I just want to quickly say, I think Tom's approach, I think that's an incredibly healthy mindset and applaud you for that. I think a couple of things. One, like lots of us are experts in our own specific little area. And it's not reasonable to expect to be an expert in every area, but you often have something you're passionate about. So it might be around dietary change. It might be renewable energies. It might be that you're really into playing football or rugby and you've been thinking about the environmental impact of the sport. And so I think you can always try to pivot the conversation to where you are more confident and you can go, oh, I don't know a lot about nuclear energy. However, I know something that is really important is this, this thing that I am really passionate about. So we can try to like focus on the areas where we are experts. But I also think it's entirely reasonable to just be upfront that you're not an expert in an area and say like, I don't know the answer to that. Why don't we look it up together? We all have phones in our pockets now. We all have Google. Like, why don't we Google that together and see if we can find an answer? Or even I'm going to look that up because I'm interested and I'll come back to you later. I think that is entirely fair. And just, don't be afraid to admit when you don't know, because you can usually tell when someone's blagging. And I think it's better to just be upfront about, I'm not an expert. I'm interested in this. I'll Google it later. This is what I think, though.
I've been trying to get better at that because sometimes people ask me questions and I know the answers, and then kind of like what we're doing today, right? Then the questions keep coming, but now you feel like you have to know it all. And I really like that idea of, we have these tiny supercomputers in our pocket. Why don't we just look it up together and figure it out together, sort of situation. Yeah.
And that can lead to interesting conversations around like which sources do we trust? Are we going to pay attention to the AI summary that Google has put there, or do we want to delve into, a source from Harvard or
multiple birds with one stone? Like, we can talk about climate change and misinformation and journalistic sources.
And then that's 3 hours later.
And then 3 hours later, the sun has gone down. But it brings up an interesting point here too, that is climate change unique among kind of hot button issues? I feel like it shares, and it's come out, it shares lots of similarities with kind of other topics and how you'd approach talking about them with other people.
So more and more we are seeing the impacts of climate change, in our own backyards. We're seeing it like every day. A couple of years ago, there was a really bad heat wave in the UK, and like nearly 3,000 people died just in England and Wales. And that was just a couple of years ago. Again, not to talk about what's happened in Bangladesh and in Jamaica and everywhere. So we are seeing the like impacts locally, but up until recently, that wasn't so much the case. It was kind of like a subject where you could go like, oh, well, that's happening over there. I don't need to worry about it right now. One of my friends has a 13-year-old son, and I spoke, and she's like a lefty Guardian reading, tofu eating liberal, and I asked her if she was like really concerned about climate change, about the type of world that her son would grow up into, because I would be worried about that if I had kids. And she said not at all. She said that she hated to admit it, but she thought like it would be bad for like kids born in other countries, but in the West, in the UK, like he'd probably be absolutely fine. She's more worried about like cancer or dementia. And I was like, we don't want to ruin your worldview, but actually, no, his life is going to be deeply affected, even in the UK. And I think I have gone off on a tangent and lost the original question there. But yeah, I think environmental issues, climate change suffers from a immediacy issue. That making people realize that this is happening here now to them, to their kids. It's not just something you can dismiss as it's happening over there.
Time out. Shel. Laura just said something really interesting, and I need to know if it's true. Is it true that people don't tend to think that climate change is really going to affect them?
Yeah, all the time. We talk about this a lot. We talk about how the way that people experience climate change is through extreme weather, right? So that's either your door is being beaten down because of a big system or weather system. You're walking outside and it's really hot. Or I think the way most of us get it, which is through your phone, you're scrolling Instagram, TikTok, whatever it might be, and you see all the videos of this big catastrophic event. But there's actually a lot of really interesting research, specifically from the Yale program on climate change communication, about this. Every single year for over a decade, they've been asking people the same questions to understand, at least here in the States, how they feel about climate change. And does it surprise you to know that 72% of Americans, at least in 2024, knew that climate change was real?
Oh, that's a lot higher than I thought deep down. That's a good amount, or more than you'd think just based upon the way people are afraid about talking about climate change.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of it, which is why this is such a great conversation. I think the other thing too is, the people you hear from that don't believe in climate change or maybe are challenging it, I think it's just the vocal minority. This shows us. And if you really want to drill down to it, we know that climate change is caused by heat trapping pollution, burning coal, oil, methane gas that we as humans have done. Still over 50% of Americans understand that we are the primary cause for climate change. Now, to break down what Laura said, though, remember she said that most people, at least in the Western civilization, don't think that climate change is going to impact them. So when you really ask the question of, do you think that climate change is going to harm somebody in the United States, either a moderate or great deal of an amount? Overwhelmingly, 63% of people say, yes, climate change will probably hurt somebody within the 50 states. But what do you think they say when you ask if climate change is going to impact them?
Well, if it's anything like the people I know, they probably say, it's going to happen to somebody else. It's not going to happen to me.
Right. And we do that all the time. 45% of Americans think that it will harm them personally. And if you've walked out to maybe a heat wave that is more intense or lasting longer than average, or what typically you expect even in the summertime, you've experienced climate change. If you've been in one of a recent hurricane, yes, a hurricane's going to hurricane, but we know that they're made worse because of climate change. So really, that's where these conversations, I think, are important, because we really need to help people understand that climate change doesn't happen a distance away. It happens now, and hopefully it doesn't happen to you repetitively, but at some point in your life, you have likely experienced some sort of fingerprint of climate change.
Hey, Shel, can I time out my timeout for a second?
A timeout inception?
I'm going to time out. And now we're living within 2 timeouts. At the beginning, Laura said something interesting. she said that folks tend to underestimate pretty much how often others around them feel the same way about climate change. Is that true too here in the United States?
For the most part, yeah. So we dug into it, and there's a 2024 study that was released. 89% of people, not just in the United States, on it, let's zoom this out to the global aspect that it is. 89% of people around the globe want climate actions from their governments and from other governments. So they understand that climate change is global and that we have to tackle it on a pretty large scale. Now, 2 in every 3 people globally said that they would be willing to contribute 1% of their income towards things that can help mitigate the impacts of climate change. Not to say that you necessarily have to do that, Tom, if you're not capable, but I think it's really interesting that 2 out of 3 people, which is a pretty good number. I don't know. I'm not great at math, but I feel like 2/3 is pretty good. Saying that, yeah, I'd throw something at it to help the cause shows us that most people do want us to do something about it and understand that it is a problem that is impacting us all.
You know, it's crazy to think that those numbers are that high. You really get a completely different impression sometimes. And sometimes I feel like I give myself that wrong impression even when I'm talking to people about climate change. I just kind of assume sometimes that people don't care. But the numbers are the numbers, and the numbers say something different.
The math is going to math. Does that help you know when you have one of these conversations where you're like, I don't know if I should have this? Does that help you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because I think I naturally go into conversations thinking, oh, this person probably doesn't care about the topic, but they probably do, and they probably care about it more than I can even imagine. So maybe I shouldn't be as nervous as I am. I'm just bringing it up in everyday conversation with people.
Okay, so put that in the back of your mind and let's get back to the conversation. And I guess
I'll lift both of my timeouts.
on double timeout.
Undouble timeout, undouble timeout. Yeah, it goes into other research that always says, when you're asked people, what are you most concerned about? Like climate change is always like consistently like number 17 on the list. And then you look at the things above it and you're like, well, climate change affects that, and it affects that, it affects that, and that, and that. But sometimes it's hard to have folks it's hard to ask someone to like put things like to weigh short term over long term and not feel like you're making a value judgment when you're having a conversation with them. And I wonder how avoiding the judginess, I think, can be difficult. And that's always in the back of my head when I'm talking with someone about climate change.
Yeah, I really relate to that. Again, from a vegan perspective, like try so hard to avoid any trace of judginess because I'm genuinely like, I'm not really judging people for what they're eating. I do think it'd be better if we were all ate more plant-based. But like, if I'm having lunch with a friend and they've chosen to have the chicken, I'm not sitting there judging them for that action.
Yeah, I think that's one maybe breakdown in communication that is a little more. And maybe this is just like this online world where you don't have to talk to somebody face to face, but just remembering that they are people and like you really do have more in common than you might think. So even when you're having these conversations, like just because you don't necessarily agree in the moment, like you still like I feel like when you see that person, you get a better sense of just knowing that they are actually a human standing in front of you. Um, and that's, yeah, I don't really know how to complete that thought other than the fact that like, I think that part of the conversation is really important and we lose that a little bit, especially in a digital world of communication.
And this is why it's so important that we do talk to our friends and family and in person and, the bus driver, the hairdresser, etc. That we talk to our social networks, basically, that we need to change these norms around having these conversations. We need to normalize talking about climate change. Because if everyone realized, oh my God, everyone does care about climate change, it makes, well, why isn't the government acting on it that much stronger? Like the first step is that we realize we all care. The next step is we organize and we demand change. And yeah, like you said, that's hard to do online where you're talking to a screen or an anonymous username or whatever. And that's where I'd start with the people you meet face to face, where you can have those more human conversations.
Okay, so let's loop back for a second to where we started about like social media, because what if, and this is where I think you could all of a sudden start a food fight at the table, or like someone flips the table and walks away and then like Christmas is ruined, right? What if it is something, what if it's the opposite? What if you're saying something and they drop a little nugget, but deep in your soul, deep in your mind, like you have studied this and you know what they said is just categorically untrue or misinformation that they've plucked from the internet. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. So this wasn't a family thing, but a few months ago, a plumber came round to work on something in the bathroom, and I was in my living room working my laptop, and he had an apprentice with him, and I heard him say to the apprentice about how he knows climate change isn't real, and I was just on my laptop as a like sort of climate scientist, and I was just like, I just can't let this go unchallenged in my own house. Like, I don't want to start an argument with the person who's working on the plumbing because I need water, but I just can't let this go. And so I just sort of like yelled up from the sofa saying, like, I'm really sorry to interrupt. I'm actually a climate scientist. I assure you that the climate science is real. And there's this moment of silence. And then his apprentice just burst out laughing and was just like, she told you. And then she took over the conversation for me and started talking to him about it. And I was so relieved. I was very pleased I did say something because I was like, I would be regretting the fact I hadn't spoken up. And yeah, I think I am the type of person that would find it hard not to rise to that height. Other people might be able to resist better. But I would have to say, my experience, my knowledge says actually the opposite. I'd try to phrase it non-antagonistically, for sure. And if it looks like it's going to brew into an argument, I'd probably just say, I'm confident that the science says this. However, it's family dinner. Let's not have an argument about it and leave it there. And I think that's reasonable.
One, that's great. And that's the super advice. As you were saying that story, it reminded me of, I was in an Uber one time with a car full of meteorologists at a weather conference, and our Uber driver found out we were meteorologists and started, doing the same thing, like listing all the reasons. Didn't even ask like if we believe climate change or like knew that climate change was real, just started listing off the reasons why climate change wasn't real. And I think the little side kicker of this is that we were in an EV. And so I had a chance to use that, but everyone just turned to look to me because they knew that I was the one that like talks about climate change the most in my work. And it was like one of those moments where I was like, okay, I just really wanted to get to dinner, but like, okay, we'll get into this conversation. But to your point, having that conversation with him, I obviously didn't like completely change his mind in that 15-minute car drive, but like he was more open to hearing what I had to say than I thought he would have from the beginning of that conversation.
And just to be clear, they did fix your pipes after that conversation. Thank goodness. I was very worried.
So my biggest concern, I was like, or if he just storms out of here angrily.
So maybe that leads to this. And what's the most surprising conversation, or maybe the most bizarre conversation you've had around climate change? And did it turn out maybe better than you thought it would, or like worse than you thought it would? Like, have you ever had just like this conversation you walked away from, you're like, wow, that was not what I expected to happen at all?
I went to the doctor a year ago, and he asked, there's a student doctor in as well, and while he was like examining me, he asked what I did, so I explained I was an environmental scientist, and he went into how there's no real evidence. He doesn't think there's good evidence for climate change to exist, and so I was really taken aback. One, because I felt it was a bit unprofessional. Two, this was an educated person, like this was a doctor. And like, I know quite a lot of doctors are really concerned about climate change from a health impact. Like climate change is going to affect like people's health, people's lives. So I was really taken aback by that. I don't know if I handled it particularly well because I was ill. This was at the doctor's office and I didn't want to get an argument, but I just sort of, I think I just wondered like, yeah, I don't really believe cancer's real. I don't think there's good evidence for it. And he was just like, what? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, but there's lots of scientific evidence about cancer. And I was like, well, there's lots of scientific evidence about climate change. And he just sort of went, and left it there. While the student doctor, who was like a young woman, was behind him with this overhead back, was just going, at me. um, so yeah, I doubt I changed his mind or anything, but that was a disappointing conversation because I wasn't expecting it in that context from that person.
Yeah, but going back to that normalizing part, like, do you think that dropped like that little nugget in his brain so that as he was driving home or when we got all, yeah, yeah, it made me talk to his partner. It was like, you'll never believe maybe the same thing that happened to you, right? Just on the opposite side. Like,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
But I was relieved that at least the student doctor was, clearly disagreeing with him, even if she didn't feel like she could say it to his face.
Okay, so what's your one tip? If you had to just drill it down to one thing, your one tip to say, like, this, if you want to talk about climate change with a stranger, with a family member, whoever, like, what's your one tip of what they should do?
So that's a really hard question. I think,
What we're here for, the hard questions.
I think I mentioned this before, but I think maybe don't worry about having a huge in-depth conversation and just start trying to sprinkle it into everyday conversations. Like you mentioned the weather, mentioned climate change, you mentioned how you got to work, say you're thinking of getting an EV or bike. Like keep it casual, but keep it common, basically. It doesn't have to be a huge sit-down conversation. It can just be something that you're normalizing through everyday conversations without feeling like you're judging or preaching or anything like that.
I love that because it feels weird to say it like that, normalizing it. But then when you think about it, that's how we do and talk about so many other things that we don't even bother realizing it anymore, that we're just dropping little bits and we're moving on to other things. Like that's how like most normal conversations actually occur. But we have this weird sort of like block with climate and other sorts of issues like that. So I like that a lot as a tip. Just drop it. And you don't have to, before you cut into the turkey and everyone gets their cranberries, you don't have to have a 3-hour lecture about the latest research on climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
But if people want that, we're more than happy to dive into a full-on lecture.
Boy, do I have some YouTube videos for you that I could share. Okay, anything else that you want to add?
No, I think this has been a really interesting conversation. If I'm allowed to give one other tip, it is just remember you do know your friends and family better than anyone else. So do try and personalize the conversation to them. Talk about the things that they'll be the most interested in.
Well, Tom, that was a lovely little conversation.
That was a really great chat.
What do you think you would do as a climate scientist or the meteorologist that you are? Let's say meteorology right now. And you're sitting in your living room, maybe working on a forecast, and a plumber is there in your house, and they're like, "Oh, those meteorologists don't know what they're talking about. It's not going to rain today." Like, you have to calculate in the moment. Like, do you say something? Do you let it go? I think that's interesting.
How big is the leak? How close are they to being done with it? Is it something that I can patch over real quick? And then I'd be like, you know what? Let me just bring up the radar real quick and give them a good little view about all the places it's raining, even though it may not be raining right outside the window of the house.
But I've done that a couple times where I've just like popped open my radar and be like, "Oh, look at all this rain that's coming our way." Yeah.
It looks like a 75% chance of rain all over the place. Although that's a huge consideration, which is why it's unbelievable that Laura managed to not only talk with her plumber, but also her doctor about climate change after they said something that just wasn't true. And honestly, I can think of very little conversations that I would want to have less in that situation than those two. And if Laura's able to do it and have success, there's really no reason why I should be too shy when it happens to me.
I really like how she said to normalize it, because it's really what I've been thinking a lot about with climate communication lately. Is just like little nuggets, sprinkle it in. You remember Salt Day, where you just like threw the salt on? Yeah, just little drops here and there, and I think that could really help go a long way. Because one big thing you always hear is like less is more, right? So we don't need to necessarily drown people in facts, but just give them these little pieces to formulate the questions in their head, and then hopefully they'll come back and have more of these conversations.
Yeah.
With you.
Climate change is normal. It's normal sense that it's happening. Like it should be come up in conversation normally because it's something that's occurring and there's no way around it. So why aren't we talking about it more? Even when we're just dropping a little Salt Bay-esque climate information in our everyday combos.
I miss the Salt Bay memes. Those should come back. What we do have already for you that's not missing, if you go to climatecentral.org, you can find more information about how to talk to people, those stats we talked about with the program on climate change communication, just the idea of how more people want to be talking about climate change together. All that's up at climatecentral.org. And of course, you can check out Laura's guide on how to speak with your family and friends about environmental issues whenever you like. Tom, do you think that your conversations will go smoother from this point forward?
Oh, I think so. I think I might get some of those guides too and just like leave them around the places. So happens that people pick them up and read. I think that's a good thing to happen.
There you go. Tom doing his part in his community. All right. I am Shel Winkley.
And I'm Tom DiLiberto.
We appreciate you joining in, and we'll catch you back here on the next episode of Curious So Quiet.